Hello, welcome to the Nomiki Show. I am Nomiki Konst. You are watching one of our specials this week where we are interviewing authors of books that are coming out. I'm going to say post-pandemic books so they can go around the country and actually see people and have, the traditional book tour. But for those of you at home, we have the privilege of speaking with an amazing author, Marlon Peterson. He is the author of Bird Uncaged, an abolitionist freedom song. He is the principal at the Presidential Group, a social justice consulting firm. He is the host of the Decarcerated podcast, a senior Atlantic fellow for racial equality, and a member of the Aspen Global Leadership Network, as well as the 2015 recipient of the Soros Justice Fellowship. And on top of all that, he was named by Ebony Magazine as one of America's 100 most influential and inspiring leaders in the Black community. His TED Talk, you may not know, you may remember, is Am I Not Human? It was a call for criminal justice reform. It has over 1.2 million views, probably more now at this point, because that's how the internet works. And, last night I was watching TED Talks all night and I was like, how did I get into this rabbit hole of just watching TED Talks? It started with watching something about psychedelics, and then suddenly it's about cleaning my house. I'm like, how does this work?
The bigger question is, how did you start with psychedelics?
I don't know. It was clickbait. It was clickbait. TED Talk. That's what happened. It was like when an 85-year-old is talking about psychedelics, you got to listen to it. You have to understand why. So Marlon, thank you first off for joining us today and sharing your story with us.
Sure, thanks, man.
So let's talk about your story, because this is the root of the book. You grew up in New York City, in Brooklyn, and you found yourself in circumstances that are not uncommon in this country, horrifyingly not uncommon, but are incredibly unjust. And your life has been shifted drastically because of our criminal justice system. So I don't want to tell your story. So could you share what happened to you when you were young?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm Brooklyn, New York, and I always say the son of Caribbean immigrants. And we, like many Black families, and I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and like many Black families who were poor, who were trying to make it together, particularly as an immigrant family, we're trying to figure out ways to make ends meet. But I don't want to give the impression that we were like dirt poor, but we definitely just had enough to get by, and I'm thankful for that. But, growing up in a neighborhood, which is Crown Heights, Brooklyn, once again, like many folks, we experienced a lot of things. Drugs was very rampant. There was violence around us, violence in my building, my apartment building that I grew up in. And that alongside, as an aside, I was also an honor student, a Jehovah's Witness. I always kind of throw that in there as because people tend to, I think when we think about the criminal legal space and incarceration, there's this, broken family sort of situation, single parent household and drugs in the household. And I want to sort of break that sort of mold and understanding that the criminal legal space is a catch-all, right? And particularly from certain communities. It doesn't mean you don't have to have, because I had a 2-parent household. So, I mean, the book speaks about those experiences. Also, at a young age, I was sexually assaulted at gunpoint. And I speak to how that particular experience as a kid at 14 years old sort of shifted my complete outlook on what life was at that point in time, to the point where, 4 years after that, I was myself shot. And then a year after that, at 19, I was facing a life prison sentence, for which I served eventually 10 years for. So, but, the book is also about really sort of creating a primer in the sense of how everyday trauma that we don't really talk about, and particularly when you think about young folks, how everyday traumas, particularly in Black and brown communities, how that impacts them without them consciously understanding that they're being impacted by it.
So, okay, so you experienced sexual assault, which I think everybody has an understanding that would affect your psyche. Were you aware of it at the time? Were you open about it? Was it addressed?
No, not at all. I kept it to myself for 8 years. The first time I ever told anybody about it, I was actually on a prison visiting floor. At the time, I was still facing a life sentence, and I told my father about it. And when I told him, I write about this in the book, that I didn't verbally tell him, I passed him a note because I was so ashamed and so many things. And in the note where I described what happened, I literally said, please don't ever ask me about this. I don't want to ever talk about this. And, I carried that for a long time. And, and there were a lot of in the book, I speak about cages a lot. It's about physical cages, but about cages in our communities and our society that prevents us from addressing trauma. So at that time, as a kid, I grew up in not only in a super religious household, but with homophobia around me. And in my mind, like, people knew this happened to me by a man. It was a man that assaulted me. Or people will think that I'm gay. People will think that I'm soft. And that cage of homophobia, I consider like a cage in of itself. I speak about it. Is that led me to so many, many other bad decisions and more traumas throughout my life. And, it took me 8 years to eventually even tell anybody about it. But the first time I ever spoke about it was probably not until I came home from prison. So I was about in my mid-30s, the first time I had ever said it out publicly to anyone.
It's interesting, you hear these stories of sexual assault survivors where some may not even process it for themselves, maybe not even acknowledge themselves or bury it, or depending on the circumstances, they may not even realize it's sexual assault. Did you understand what had happened to you? Had you even acknowledged that it was sexual assault internally? Or if so, when?
I didn't know what it was. And, this is YouTube, but it was the first time. It was at gunpoint, and I didn't know what was happening to me in terms like with the, I speak about it in detail, and it's even hard to even speak about it to some levels now. But the sexual act that he was performing on me, I didn't know I actually didn't know what was happening. I speak about in a book that I thought it was pee. Like I didn't know what it was that was coming at that point. I want to be too graphic for your audience, but so I didn't fully comprehend what it was. And in some, like many sexual assault survivors, I blame myself for it. I shouldn't have went there. I thought, I was naive. I thought I was 14. I was 14, and in my mind, I should have been tougher than that. I should have been able to fight him off. So I didn't want people to think that I was soft. So I also, for that reason, kind of just kept it to myself. As it wasn't until I was incarcerated, I was already 2 years into the sentence that I finally said, somebody needs to know that this happened. And so I told my father about it.
Okay, so then you were shot, you said?
As a year before I was incarcerated, a friend shot me. It was a mistake, but a friend shot me in my building, in the elevator in my building.
And did you suffer severely as a result?
I mean, I was shot in my leg and my foot, actually. And, to this day, I still have, residual pain from it, like a little bit of nerve damage from there. But even in that instance, I didn't really understand at that point in time the gravity, the danger I was putting myself in that point in time around weapons and things like that. Even after I was shot, I remember carrying a gun in my cast, right? Not realizing the gravity of what I was in or the circumstances I was in. And, I was an 18-year-old kid who graduated from high school, right? So, I want to give those nuances to the conversation because once again, we think about incarceration and trauma in just one very small category. And that's like the scope and how wide, as I said earlier, it's a catch-all for Black and brown bodies particularly.
It's really important because this is, I think, why what's really fascinating about this book is you kind of delve into the gray areas and the actual human story of these statistics that many people, specifically on the left, are, wanting to address because they're seeing like the numbers and 1 out of 3 Black men go to jail. The majority of households, specifically in public housing in New York, are women-led households because of that. And so these statistics need to be addressed, but there's nuance and there's complexity and there's how it shapes a community and how it shapes, every person's upbringing, no matter what your childhood was like. So you end up in this horrifying situation in which you were a bystander, right? You were a lookout. Do you want to tell the story about how you ended up being, you served 10 years, right? And
I served 10 years, yeah. I was initially facing a life sentence so I was a lookout in a crime in which 4 people were shot and 2 people were killed in New York City here in Manhattan. At the time I was 19, and it was 5 people altogether who were part of who were arrested for it. And people from my neighborhood. And it was just sort of, people don't think about, even to this day, like I speak to my family members about it, but it was literally just hanging out. We were just hanging out, and somebody.
What were the events? Like, how did this lead up? These were friends?
Yeah, there was a store in the city in Manhattan that one of my friends at the time knew that, they would have money at the store at a certain time. They have a chunk of money apparently. And they said, well, we can rob the store. And they were actually, in a funny way, they were just talking about it around me and not actually saying, Marlon, be a part of this. And because we were hanging out with each other, I was like, yo, I could be down with it. What you need me to do? Without actually even, it sounds so sort of like naive, and maybe it is a lot of naivete involved with it. But once again, I said a year earlier, I was shot. So I really wasn't concerned. I wasn't really aware of the danger I was putting myself in, even at that point in time.
You were experiencing trauma also. Like, let's keep reminding folks, you've experienced multiple traumas at this point, and you're young, and that there's a million factors there.
Yeah, for sure. And I always say, I don't want people to think that to excuse me for it, or that I didn't deserve some accountability for what I was a part of. What I am saying, though, is that like how easy it was to be a part of something so tragic, and that many of the crimes, and I spent a good time, probably the last 5 years of my sentence, helping other men prepare for their release from prison, and how so many of the people who were a part of some very heinous experiences, it was just people say about a moment of 1 second of indecision. Literally is that. The thing about it is, and I go back to the communities that we come from, the options, the opportunities to participate in these things are always there, right? They're always there because they're also very limited options to do other things and limited exposure to be a part of other things. And you're dealing with multiple traumas. In the book, I think the flashpoints for people is the sexual assault and the shooting and the arrest and conviction, which are important, are huge. But I speak about very small things that were happening every day, not only to me, but to people around me. And the fact that it's amazing that most people don't end up in the places that I ended up in, right? And that speaks to the resilience. So the book is also like a freedom song, because it's also speaking to the resilience and the possibilities that we have, because I know we can get through those things.
So you end up, you're with your friends and you're hanging out, and they have this idea to go rob. Did they have had any of them ever been involved, to your knowledge, then or now, in any sort of violent acts or robberies or anything, in this realm before?
Well, I can say that 3 of the people involved in it who were arrested for it, I met a day before. So I didn't even know them. It was literally we hanging outside and somebody said, let's do this, right? Because we would, in another vein, earlier that week, they were like, I was with some friends, let's go to this park and play basketball. I didn't know them, so let's just go do that. So one of the people that I knew very well, and I didn't know him to be like that at that time. In fact, he was somebody in my neighborhood who people would be like, Marlon, you should be like him. He stays in the house more, and all those sort of things. He's a little bit older than me, but I didn't see that, right? I probably should have, be clear, I probably should have in hindsight, I do now. But as a kid, I saw he was somebody who's probably somebody I should try to follow, because he wasn't outside hanging out, smoking and running around the streets like I was at the time. So when, we all went to the city that day together, and I always remember like that drive from Brooklyn to Manhattan, because the crime happened in Manhattan, was one of the most quietest rides to Manhattan, which is about a 20-minute ride from where we were at in Crown Heights. No one was saying anything. And for me, in hindsight, I know that everybody was scared in that car, but nobody wanted to say anything. And of course, in hindsight, I would say, I wish I had said something. I wish this person had said something. No one did, obviously. And people paid their lives for it because we were scared and ignorant and traumatized and all those things. But yeah, I mean, that's how it happened. And when the shooting happened, I wasn't in the store. I was actually across the street from it. I didn't even actually know, I remember the gentleman, the guys walked into the store, the guys who I was with, my co-defendants, and less than 30 seconds later, shots rang out. And I didn't expect anybody I didn't know what was happening. I remember going out when it happened, I was across the street and I just saw them running. And I didn't know what was happening. And then I saw them run in a different direction. And then I saw people shooting after them. And I was completely confused, like what was happening here? And I remember I just took the train, came back home, and I turned the news on, and it was a special report, and it said that what had happened, and the people that were shooting at them came to find out were undercover narcotics police who were in the neighborhood on a separate investigation. So they were shooting at them. And, then I find out that 4 people were shot, and I see this on the news. And obviously I just don't know what happened, right? I had never been a part of anything like that in my life at that point. And, since then either. And 3 days later, the police came to my house and arrested me. And it's funny, I didn't know the police were looking for me. In my mind, I didn't think the police were after me for anything. I was actually, for what it's worth, I was more concerned about, my boy, like what he get himself into. I'm thinking about, we need to get clothes for him because he's at Rikers Island. I need to figure out how to support him. In my mind, the police are not looking for me. So they arrested me right in front of my family.
Oh my God.
I had a pair of shorts. I was actually coming from a neighbor's house, watching videotapes, and I had some videotapes in my hand. I'll never forget, I had some videotapes in my hand, and I came out my elevator, the same elevator that I was shot in. Actually, I come out my elevator, and they, are you Marlon Peterson? I'm like, yeah, and they're like, well, get against the wall, and that was the last time I saw my family until 2009. So it happened in 1999, and the next time I saw my family was in 2009.
Did you, when you came home that day, and you're watching the news, had you said to your family that you were there, that you knew what had happened, or did they? No.
So I didn't say anything to anybody. Once again, I would keep things to myself, so I didn't say anything to them. But we all knew that the person in our building was on the news, involved. So I remember them saying, like, "You sure you had nothing to do with this? 'Cause I know you know him." And I was like, nah. In my mind at the time, one is that, I didn't want to be connected to it. And I guess, so there was some level of guilt that I was there. I want to be clear about it. There's some level of guilt that I was there, but it wasn't to the level where I thought that I was culpable of anything, And so we were all, when we were arrested, we were all facing the death penalty. So in New York State at that time, the death penalty was still on the books. So because it was the level of the crime, and the heinous and the horrors of the incident, which is horrible, completely horrible, and still is, because there are people today who don't have a family member, right? But we were all facing the death penalty initially, and that's why it took about 3 years before I ended up actually getting sentenced. I eventually took a plea of 12 years in prison time.
So what's I think hard for a lot of people to understand is, you're across the street, lookout or not, the cops came, didn't matter. How would they say you're, an accomplice? What's this?
Yeah, the statute is actually one of the oldest statutes in American law, and kind of from English common law. It's called the felony homicide rule. So in the act of committing a felony, which was the robbery, a homicide happened. So everybody who is a part of the commission of the felony are now charged with the homicide. Right. I think that's something that needs to be relooked, because there are a lot of people who are in jail for that thing, that a friend of theirs did the thing and they didn't know the friend was going to do their thing. But the other part of it, I also speak about it in terms of a larger macro issue, that Donald Trump should be in jail then, right? I'm going on a large issue, but because the issue of felony homicide is that, in the commission of a thing or in the incitement of a thing, something else happened that you couldn't believe, that you didn't expect to happen, but you're not responsible for it. That felony homicide statute is what takes a lot of Black and brown kids, particularly, into the system. You ever think about, they have these things kind of like, they go into housing projects, particularly here in New York City, where they actually, after probably 1, 2 to 3 people, but they know that there's a whole community of people, of young boys and girls who might have hung out, might have been on Facebook with them, might have, what have you, and they now get them all. It's called conspiracy in federal courts. On the state level, usually felony homicide, or felony, those sort of things. But I want people to also interrogate this felony homicide statute. I think it requires interrogation. We're thinking about the criminal legal space and how terrible it is in and of itself, and how so many people get in there in the first place. And we want to think about not only reducing, but really about ending it completely, right? We need to start, one way to start to like to really interrogate that felony homicide statute. I think it's something that there are many cases around the country where there are people who have served 20, 30, 40 years in prison under the felony homicide statute, where they were a part of a thing because they hung out with this person and the person went and did the homicide or the sexual assault. Like, here's the thing, Nomiki, like this book, I mean, not only the book, the work I've done, I don't want to just focus, this book is actually a culmination of a lot of work I've done for the last 15 years or so. It's really pushing people to question the things that we think are normal about how we deal with harm in our society. And I think it's super important because as we're in a place where you have now criminal justice, not now, but within recent 5 years or so, criminal justice reform is a thing on everybody's tongue. The left is on it, the right is on it, the conservative, the radical right is on it. I don't know if we are actually really getting to the root of how pervasive the tentacles of the system are and how it captures certain people in certain communities, particularly in the urban areas. Because we all hang out with each other. You know what I mean? We all hang out, we all do things with each other, and it's so easy. So in one place, the book is about really questioning the system, but the other part of the book is about, really looking into ourselves. The second half of the book, the title of the book is an abolitionist freedom song. And, abolition, one of the core tenets of abolition is about getting to the root of the thing, getting to the root. And while, I consider myself an abolitionist in very real terms, I understand that abolition is a process of getting to the root, but also is a process of creation, like what we can do next, right? Of course, we can't close all prisons yesterday. We should, but we need to get to the root of why this is happening in the first place. And I spent a lot of time in this book, and also in the TED Talk also, I spent a lot of time really getting to the trauma, and not in a way that is overwhelming, right? I don't browbeat you about the trauma, but I speak about it in a way that shows the everyday micro traumas that people sort of just move beyond. I think they move beyond, but when things come, but at some point those things explode.
Yeah. You can move through a trauma, you can survive, but getting to the root of that trauma, which is really part of a systemic issue, getting to the root of the systemic issue, of course.
One of the reasons we never talk about it.
We never, yeah, and the incredible results, one of the incredible results of the George Floyd uprisings and Breonna Taylor uprisings of the last summer is, for once, we're having a deeper conversation with allies, maybe, I guess is the best way, and people who are learning about these systemic issues and just how much these tentacles are ingrained into our system. And watching the trial of George Floyd right now, hearing the voices of people from the community, from all aspects of the community who recognized the injustice there, but those voices never get brought into the conversation. And I think people are starting to kind of like see it in a different way, but it's just the beginning. So you served for 10 years in prison. What happened when you were released? Like, where was your mind? I mean, were you going through a process while you were in prison of understanding who you are and understanding the system and understanding how these tentacles, or did that happen afterwards? What was the process?
That happened inside, definitely inside. I'm somebody who kind of went into myself. So I didn't actually interact with a lot of people early on during in the sentence. But as I said, for the latter half of the sentence, I spent a lot of time like preparing myself to come home through preparing other people to come home, right? And I also earned a criminal justice degree while inside, right? And it wasn't through the prison, it was through a correspondence program, because I wanted to sort of study not only like, pay attention to me, but I need to understand this system in a way in which criminal justice professionals understand it as well, right? So in so many ways, I was in the system, studying the system. It was an involuntary academic sort of endeavor. But also, I grew up in prison. I spent my entire 20s there. And I learned how to be an adult there. And I had to grow up faster than obviously most people, because early on I was usually the youngest person, whatever jail or they had put me in. So I also had to learn how to navigate in a way that I also preserve my life, right? I didn't go to prison with, like, I wasn't a part of any gang structure. I didn't have an older brother, cousin, father, uncle who had experienced the system. I was literally the first person in my family to experience it. So, I always give this joke, like, I didn't know what commissary was. I remember when we, the first time they said, we're going to commissary, I was like, what does that mean? Like, what is that thing? And that's where you go get food. I'm like, where can you get food from? Like, I didn't know there were stores. And like, I'm just speaking about how ignorant and naive I was to the process. So I had to learn everything from scratch. And, I can say by the end of the decade that I spent there, I learned a couple of things. One thing is I learned about how capable I am of like surviving things. I also learned about how I learned the power of humanity in prison. I always had learned more about humanity in prison than I did out here, right? Because I was around every sort of person you would think about, religious, gender or sexual orientation, gender expression, folks who, whatever type of crime you can think about, from the worst to the not so bad, whatever that means. And I learned, because of the work I was doing inside, I learned their biographies beyond that experience. And I had to drop some of my own prejudices and biases. I learned to not be homophobic by being in prison, right? I learned that there, and not because there was some class or anything like that, but because I saw people there, I saw them more than the prejudice way I was sort of conditioned to see, people in certain ways. I learned to sort of see people who were in gangs. I had a certain prejudice against people who were in gangs, believe it or not, right? But some of my best friends were people who were in gangs. And in fact, I co-started a program in prison called HALA, How Our Lives Link All Together, which is a mentorship program that started in prison that we implemented in schools throughout New York City. And in fact, it was highlighted on Ava's documentary 13th. But I started with folks who are in gangs, right? And it's so many to see, like, that's just a title, that's a label, I want to say this, but also that all the things I was able to do inside of prison was despite prison. Because part of what people can get out of this story, listening to you, Nomiki, is that, well, prison did good for you. Prison did a lot of harm to me. That right now, thousands of dollars of therapy is working out. To this day, and I've been home 11 years now, and I've been able to travel the world. I've been able to speak in prisons and all over the world and do a lot of things, right? But there's still residues of that experience that I'm still brushing off, and so when I, in the book, I think the last words in the book is happiness is next. So this book is a memoir, but it's definitely, and I think the best type of memoir is one that's incomplete, particularly, because people think that you're supposed to write, this is what happened to me, and look at me now, the end, ta-da. And don't get me wrong, I'm a much, much more responsible human being, without question, insightful, wise, and all those sorts, and matured. But there's still things that the abolitionist politic requires that we are constantly working on ourselves, constantly dusting away prejudices, constantly dusting off stereotypes. And that includes the people who did time, right? It's not, I'm still somebody who, when I see a crime happen or I hear about a horrific thing that happened, particularly now when you think about the Asian American violence that's happening in the country, yes, those people need to go away. But then I need to question myself. And the reason why I need to question myself, because I also know that prison is not the place where they're going to get better. Now, there's definitely a conversation around removing people from who are capable of harming people again. That's definitely a legitimate concern. But prison only sort of in so many ways offer a solution to one thing. Like, they can hold somebody away for a period of time, but it's not helping them. People heal despite prison, not because of it. And that's the thing for people to really key in. We heal despite it, not because of it. So once again, we get into like the root, and that this book is not only about people who have been spent time in prison. I think this book is relatable to people in any sort of strata of our society, right? Because we all have cages in so many ways that prevents us from getting to the root of why we're not progressing, why we're harmful to our partner, our child, we're not productive as we want to be in our own personal life and our own mental health. The opening words of the book is, I do not believe in cages of any kind. Let me tell you why. And that applies to everybody. It's just that prisons are the most visible display of human hurt. humans decided we figured out a way to deal with our hurt by hurting other people. Because we all know that prisons hurt. We all have jokes, right? We all hear the comedians. What happens when you go to prison? Don't drop the soap. All those things. And I am somebody who laughs, I don't want to say in past tense, who laughs at those jokes. But one of the things we're not recognizing that those jokes are actual human beings. And we know consciously that if you go there, things like that can happen to you. But, we block it out. We laugh it away. We think, well, you deserve that harm. And we can in some ways, we can justify that maybe some people deserve retribution. But we also got to realize that retribution does not make a society better.
Right. So, you go into prison very young. You're 19 years old, I believe, or you were sentenced at 19?
No, I got arrested at 19.
You got arrested. Got it. Okay. It's incredible that at such a young age, entering this space that you're completely unfamiliar with, you have no ties, no family ties, no, there's really no consciousness of what you're getting into, that you at some point made a decision to really take the time and do what you could with it. Was that immediate, eventual? How did that process, because that is a psychological process, that's a headspace, that's a meditative space you have to get in and be in. It's when I hear these transformative stories, I think, how on earth, after all of this trauma and this environment that is just full of toxicity and survival and, and you're feeling like the system already wronged you, I assume, which it did. How can you get to a space of, okay, this is how I am going to make the best of my time here and do something with it for others eventually?
I started writing to myself. I think at the core, I'm a writer. I'm an activist and all those other things, but I'm a writer. So I just started keeping a journal. And, a lot of folks in prison speak about that, keeping journals. For me, that was the safest place for me, because it was the safest place for me because it was the place I can write down everything I didn't know and my frustrations and my fears and even dreams, right? And it helped me in so many ways interrogate where I went wrong, right? I didn't go wrong on October 13th, 1999, when the crime happened. That's not when I went wrong, right? I had to sort of realize I went wrong way before that. When I say I went wrong, understanding that there were things that triggered me, that I had never sat and just understood that these things were really working in my subconscious. And then so from that process, eventually I got involved, and I should also say I became somewhat religious for a part of my bid. I said I raised as Jehovah's Witness. So for early part of my sentence, I started, really getting into the Bible more. I actually read the Bible. I would say a joke, I brag that I read the Bible 3 times, right? And book by book and studied it and started going to the Greek and, the Hebrew, Aramaic and all that sort of stuff to sort of understand it. I eventually evolved beyond religious texts. But those are some of the things I think that helped me realize that, well, Marlon, you had certain gifts as a young person. I was a valedictorian as a kid, honor roll student, all those sort of things. And that you shied away from those things because you thought that the way to survive in your neighborhood was to be a different type of person, right? And so me being able to get in touch with who I was in a way helped me realize that, I can offer things to other people now, right? I had certain foundations that sadly, many other folks around me didn't have. Right, I was literate, you know what I mean? I'm just using that as an example. And I had a family that cared for me, right? I had a family that cared for me. We didn't have a lot and they couldn't see me or anything like that often, but I knew I had those things. Sorry for the background, I'm in Brooklyn, so.
All good, we're New Yorkers.
You know how it is.
We're used to it.
Yeah, but those are some of the things that helped me get to the path of where I said, as a young person, the 20s is still relatively young, that there was things I could contribute. And actually there's one moment, there's a flashpoint that I speak about in the TED Talk and in the book that really helped me realize that, oh, wow, I'm worth something. Because a part of what the crime and becoming incarcerated, particularly for the things that I was, I felt like a piece of, can we curse on this? I don't know. But, I felt like a piece of shit, right? I felt like so terrible, right? And I felt like I'm worthless, right? And the system, compounds that. And as I would speak about Dr. Nadia Lopez, a friend from my neighborhood who was a teacher at the time at a middle school, and had reached out to me, wrote a letter to me maybe 5 or 6 years into the sentence, and was, telling me about her, her life as a teacher, but also about the struggles that she has in like having her young people who are middle school students, really understand like the dangers that surround them, and that, they need to sort of express what's going on in their lives. So she asked me to write a letter to them, some words of wisdom as in the letter. I still have the actual letter here. And, I reluctantly wrote it because I didn't think that, in my mind, I was questioning, why would she ask me? Isn't there somebody else better than me that she can reach out to? I'm in prison. Why would you think I can offer anything? So I eventually took up her offer, wrote the letter, and about 3 weeks after I wrote the letter, I was in the cell, my cellmate, and, I got a big manila envelope from the mail on my gate that I was in, and I didn't get a lot of mail, and definitely not manila envelopes. And it was a letter from her, like an open letter, from the school, and it was 17 letters. One of her classes, all the young people wrote me a letter. And that turned into a correspondence program where she also sent me, she started sending me books about writing curriculum, developing curricula. So I devoured those things. So it turned into a program where I would create curricula that she would implement in her character education component of her class with her kids. And along with a general letter and a prompt for the young people to write me, and then they would write the letters, and she would screen them and send them back to me. And so that process went back and forth for about a year. And I would catch myself writing up to 50 letters every time, because it became so popular that kids from other classes heard about it and they wanted to be a part of it too. So we had called it the Young Scholars Program. That program led to HOLLA, the program that I spoke to you about earlier. That gave me a sense of purpose and a sense of like relevancy, and that's, in so many ways, that's why I'm here with you today, why I have a book, right? In so many ways, because there was somebody who saw a possibility in me.
Incredible. That's incredible. Wow. Really, really beautiful. And now, when you were released, I mean, in the work you've been doing over the last, decade and 12 years, has been working with people who have had similar experiences. How do you come out of the prison system, a system that is just, in every single way, the life leading up to it, everything we've been discussing, how do you get into this mindset that you've gotten into? And so what is the kind of work that you do now with folks?
Yeah, I mean, so HOLLA was one program that we started and is still functioning. Another youth program that I had created here in Brooklyn is called Youth Organizing to Save Our Streets. So we would train teenagers or teenagers, high school age teenage young folks to be organizers, community organizers around violence and gun violence prevention. And that's still functioning. And since then, I've been able to sort of advise and inform around larger issues around criminal justice and violence in our communities. And some of that's through public speaking, some of that has been through writing. So, I've written in a lot of places about these issues from a practitioner standpoint. And I've been able to sort of like have these same dialogues with people, and as I mentioned earlier, in the prisons, but in other parts of the world as well. I've been able to visit, I've been able to visit prisons in Trinidad, where my family's from, or in South Africa, working on a project now in New Zealand. So it's in South Africa. I am in a place of constantly learning how deep criminalization is, one, how deeply embedded into our fabric of society it is, but also constantly experiencing the possibilities of people who have had some of the worst luck in life. You know what I mean? I just kind of want to just put it like that, the possibilities in that and amplifying it. So, there's a podcast, right? And the podcast is about amplifying the journeys of success of people who spend time in jails and prisons. And, some people, as, Shaka Singhal, who is apparently now Oprah's best friend, right? Like his story, right? Because I understand the biographies. The thing that I learned my time away was that, as I said, the biographies of people are so much more important than the flashpoint of harm that they were a part of. And that's the abolitionist politic. Getting to that root, I keep going to that because that's the second half of this book, the title of the book, Bird Uncaged, an abolitionist freedom song. I want my work, not only during the last 5 or 6 years of my incarceration, but definitely during the last decade, has been always trying to get to the root of what's happening in individuals' lives. And that also requires that we look at state violence as well.
Yeah.
Somebody who's also very critical of state violence, police violence, because we can't only look internally at Marlon or Crown Heights or my homies that I hung out with. We are also being influenced by what's happening around us. And I'll give you this one example, and it's very current. In a Derek Chauvin trial, there was a young person who testified, a 9 or 10-year-old person who testified. A 9, 10-year-old person experienced that trauma. And they are not the first person at that age. We all experienced, the video was screened. I mean, it was on all our feeds, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, all the places. Those things happen daily or almost daily to young people. And so state violence is directly educating people about how, one, a sort of sense of learned hopelessness, that like, this is just how it's gonna be. And also, one, I can't look to you to help me if something happens to me. And matter of fact, I might as well just keep it to myself, because maybe it's safer I just keep it to myself. Like, these are all the messages that are coming from the state, and that the state is not here to protect you. And then you go to your neighborhood and you have some people, other young girls, boys, people, humans who are also traumatized and are probably hurting you because they're traumatized, right? And so I always say it's amazing. I know the power of us. You know, I always think particularly Black and brown folks, how powerful we are, because most of us don't go to jail. Most of us don't go there. And that speaks about, I'm of course, that's great to know, but it also speaks of how powerful we are. And I want to always sort of amplify that and lift that up too, because with the trauma, we've also found ways to conquer it and move beyond it and grow beyond it. And I want to amplify that more. And I also want us who have been through those things to see how powerful we are, and that, you know, it isn't jail that saved you. It isn't prison that saved you. You have agency, and it just so happened that you were in a certain place and that agency showed up. But when I look back in my own life, there were, obviously, and I speak to you about the things that happened to me as a teenager, there were no interventions happening at all. And one might say, well, you didn't say anything about it. I didn't know that it was a thing to do.
What are you supposed to do? Yeah.
You know, and so many young people are dealing with that every day. And I want people to sort of see that part of the young person, see the root of why they are doing the things that they're doing. Because no baby is born wanting to hurt somebody else. They learn that idea.
Hurt people, but the systemic abuse is what's facilitating this. And I mean, I think it's really incredible that you say, despite everything, people are resilient and pushing through, despite every single obstacle along the way, every systemic obstacle, the traumas that you're facing, traumas in the community, the traumas people are pushing on each other. Resiliency is really it. Marlon Peterson, such an incredible conversation and really a beautiful book. And thank you for sharing it and sharing your story and really using your life and your life's experience to address not only systemic issues, to educate a larger audience, but to work with people directly. It's really a beautiful use of your time on this planet.
Thank you. Thank you. Healed people, heal people.
Healed people, heal people. I love that. Beautiful response. Thank you, Marlon Peterson.